listening to the Labor Notes podcast, the weekly show from Labor Notes on rank-and-file news and organizing tactics. I'm pod co-host Danielle Smith, organizer at Labor Notes.
And I'm pod co-host Natasha Elena Yulman, a staff writer at Labor Notes. This is a crucial moment to talk about government programs that the billionaire class has been steadily trying to erode in the past few decades, because those attacks have culminated in an administration willing to shut down and deflate entire agencies and programs meant to support working people. The GOP budget bill that passed this month, the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, would dramatically cut Medicaid, make it a lot harder for people to access the food stamps program for families in poverty, and it would roll back federal funding for clean energy programs. This is all, of course, while extending tax cuts for the wealthy, and notably, also allocating several tens of billions of dollars to fund the detentions of immigrants and ICE raids.
It's some really insidious stuff. Natasha, I'm glad we're taking a break from doom scrolling about the bill to talk more today about some of the programs under attack and how people won them in the first place. It's also just really striking that one of the more extreme elements of this bill and assaults on working people is just how much funding is now going to immigration enforcement and not towards addressing working people's need for health care or to address the cost of living crisis in any real way. In fact, between the cuts to Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act, something like 17 million people will lose their health insurance, according to the Washington Post, which cited numbers from the Congressional Budget Office. And nearly 3 million people will lose their SNAP food assistant benefits, also according to one of the estimates by the CBO of the Senate version of the bill, which the House largely maintained with some changes.
Yeah, it's going to take some time to even wrap our heads around the scale of the damage that'll be unleashed by rolling back these public support programs. To your point on immigration, a policy expert at the American Immigration Council talked to Jacobin recently about how the bill sets aside something like $45 billion for ICE detentions and another $30 billion for ICE to move immigrants around. He called it a, quote, completely unprecedented amount of funding for ICE, end quote. And it's just bizarre to hear the talking point that this is somehow about shrinking the role of government, because this massive expansion of the ICE budget, while shutting down essential programs people depend on, makes it so that the government's role in our public and private spaces could not be more invasive and overbearing in the lives of working people, regardless of whether they're citizens or immigrants of any status. The core of these attacks is the idea propagated by the billionaire class that government programs that actually support working people should be terminated or cut because they're somehow inefficient and unreliable, not to mention vehicles for ideas that they don't really like. While people might be trying to sell the bill as going after immigrants, it's going to affect everyone on Medicaid, regardless of whether they're citizens or whatever their status may be. And it's also worth noting that Medicaid is administered by state programs, so they often go by different names. Many people may be in for a rude shock when they realize that a program they might know as Medi-Cal, for instance, as it's called in California, boots them out because of these Medicaid cuts. And because of its effect on the deficit, it could trigger $490 billion in cuts to Medicare from 2027.
Right. And back to what we were saying earlier, many of the government programs that serve the public interest didn't come out of nowhere. I'm glad that we have Labor Notes editor Jenny Brown, who has written about this, back with us today to bring in some context. Hi, Jenny. Thanks for joining us again.
Hi, Danielle. I'm happy to be back.
Well, Jenny, around the time the White House was putting out draft budget proposals that were laying out some drastic cuts to public spending, we ran your piece titled, "The Government Programs They're Axing Came From Our Struggles." Listeners can read it on labornotes.org, and if you subscribe to our magazine, it also appeared in the June issue as one of our Slingshot columns, where we write about some of the big issues workers are talking about. But yeah, this piece was a rebuke of the idea that these programs are merely bureaucratic functions and not the life-saving services they are. And you also contextualize them as something working people have had to really fight hard for. Could you talk a little bit about some of those struggles?
Yeah, so this started even before the big ugly bill with the Trump executive orders that gutted agencies like the Occupational Safety and Health Administration and the Environmental Protection Agency, not to mention the National Labor Relations Board, which was already overwhelmed with work due to there's an uptick in union organizing. And they've been swamped with work because corporations like Amazon and Starbucks are committing hundreds of unfair labor practices to try to stop their workers from unionizing. These are agencies that were built through decades and sometimes centuries of struggle by working people and unions as a defense against corporate dictatorship. But all we're hearing is, government is bad, bureaucracy is bad. For example, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, which the Trump administration has just made deep cuts to, was created by the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970. This legislation was the product of struggles by labor, and in particular, it was led by Tony Mazzocchi, who was a leader in the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, or OCAW. And he looped in environmental activists in a powerful coalition that was able to push this bill through even when Nixon was president. Chemical workers were getting sick and dying, and bosses just acted like that was part of the job until OCAW started asking questions, and they got doctors and scientists and workers to actually talk together about what was going on in the plant. And in fact, workers had to even fight to find out what chemicals they were working with and what the health effects were. We ran an article in April by Micah Niemeyer Walsh, who is the vice president of AFG Local 3840 at NIOSH. So this is the agency that does all the research that OSHA uses to regulate chemicals and hazards. For example, they test the respirators that workers use to make sure that they really work. They keep a registry of firefighters who get cancer to figure out what's causing it and what could be changed on the job to prevent it. As Micah said in the piece, quote, "It's the small agency you've never heard of that has probably saved your life," unquote. Even if you don't work in a chemical plant or you aren't a firefighter, leaks and explosions affect everyone. And that was the argument that Mazzocchi made when he was rallying support among the public to win the Occupational Safety and Health Act. Bad chemicals in the plants that the OCAW members were working with are not going to stay in the plants. They're going to affect residents, consumers, and wildlife. So there's no magical barrier that will keep us safe as long as corporations are allowed to use these poisons. Social Security is another good example of something that unions won. The idea was first launched in the US by the rail brotherhoods in the 1920s. We didn't win it until the disaster of the Great Depression, which combined with the rich in America really fearing a revolution like had just happened in Russia. But it still took massive union organizing to win it. So I think that if we want to limit the damage and eventually win back the things that are being destroyed, organized workers are probably the only force that can do it. We've seen that unionized federal workers have really been on the front lines defending public agencies and explaining how important the work that they do every day is for the public. And the attacks have also led to a lot more people joining their unions and organizing to protect their agencies.
Jenny, in this piece, you also talk about your experience in Hurricane Francis over 20 years ago in Florida, and how the support from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, really helped. And now, of course, the Trump administration has said it wants to end FEMA after this year's hurricane season, even though only this past weekend they had to send FEMA into Texas to deal with the heavy rainfall and severe flooding. What was it like to recover from Hurricane Francis, and what do you think something like eliminating FEMA would mean for working people?
Yeah, this past weekend with a lot of people had catastrophic flooding. So this is unfortunately really relevant. So this was in Gainesville, which is way inland in north central Florida, but we had a lot of wind from Francis, including tornadoes, and a giant hickory tree blew over and crushed part of my house. We were also out of power for a couple of weeks, and most of our neighbors had damage too. Anyway, once we chainsawed all the downed trees off of our road, sure enough, like 3 days later, nothing else is happening in town. 3 days later, here comes a Federal Emergency Management Agency agent to look at the damage, and she was able to cut us a $2,000 check right away so we could get the tree off of our house, which required a crane. And then we were able to do temporary repairs and keep the rain out. And then through FEMA again, we were able to get a $20,000 low-interest loan from the Small Business Administration so we could rebuild. I'm still paying that off, but it was a lifeboat for us at the time. So when people quote Ronald Reagan about the 9 scariest words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help," I just have to call BS on that. So as you said, this administration is trying to put an end to FEMA while also cutting staff at the National Weather Service, And all that detailed information and predictions about the weather that we get on our phones, that's collected from satellites and radar stations and planes and sensors that are all operated by a federal agency, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. And that includes the National Hurricane Center, which produces life-saving data about the probable paths of hurricanes. And as a Floridian, I can tell you, during Atlantic hurricane season, we are seriously glued to the National Hurricane Center site. So we know that cuts to FEMA and NOAA are going to cost lives. But also, I think it's important to think about how they're part of a political project, which is to undermine the idea that we collectively as a nation can all put money in to create systems to care for each other when disaster strikes. Instead, everyone's supposed to be out for themselves. And I really think it just rips apart the fabric of our society and lowers expectations about what government is supposed to be about.
Yeah, I mean, in this moment where federal programs are being attacked and cut, it feels like there is an opportunity to really highlight how effective and valuable they can be.
I think that's right. And in that piece that I mentioned by Micah, they talk about how the work that NIOSH does costs just $2.20 per worker per year. And Micah calls it one of the best deals the working class ever got from the federal government. But of course, it's been a long time since any of these programs have been properly funded, if they ever were. So, for example, you'd be lucky if OSHA gets around to inspecting your workplace every 100 years or so, given their budget. And that kind of leaves space for people to say, well, it's not efficient enough, or the inspectors aren't working hard enough, or it's a waste of money, or whatever. But I still think many people are starting to recognize that the talking points about efficiency and wastefulness are really red herrings, and to see that the real goal is to erode the protections that workers won through militant struggle.
Why have we been seeing these attacks escalate since even before the Trump administration? And what are some things we can do or that workers are doing right now to keep this administration from fully bulldozing over our public programs?
Right. Well, we should remember why it took so much effort and so long to win these things. It's not like everyone agreed, oh, yeah, clean water, safer workplaces, that's a good idea, let's do it. The rich, the employers, the corporate heads have all hated these agencies from the very first. And their focus is, of course, on short-term profits. So they don't want to spend money to keep workers safe. They don't want to be called out when they produce like faulty respirators or dangerous medical equipment. They don't want to be told they can't dump toxic waste into the river or pump pollution into the air, even if it means acid rain or climate catastrophe. So that's what they really mean when they say cut red tape or deregulate. Now, it's true that there is an irrational element to these cuts. The billionaires and corporations probably are underestimating just how much the government contributes to a functioning society that is allowing them to make money, like by maintaining interstates, ports, airports, subsidizing childcare for their workers, predicting the weather. You know, federal grants fund basic medical research from which the pharmaceutical companies profit, or like the post office, which is another agency they're trying to wreck and privatize, actually delivers cheaply to benefit Amazon. But the general desire, and I think what's really driving a lot of these Trump administration officials, is that everything should be done for profit in the private sector. So instead of us collectively paying in, all of us paying in a little, the rich paying in a lot more, so we can have clean water, or veterans can have health care, or we can have national parks. Their ideal world is one in which we would be supposed to purchase these things from a for-profit company or do without. And if you're a worker, you would be doing without. Of course, it's no surprise that some of the best advocates for the public programs that are on the chopping block are turning out to be the people who do the work, like Micah, because they know better than we do what we're losing when these programs are slashed. So I'd say what we should do is we should all be joining them in defending the government's safeguards and services that we workers have won over generations of struggle.
Thank you, Jenny. That's our episode. As always, we'll leave you with some hot tips on events that are coming up. We've got a power analysis workshop on Wednesday, July 16th, where we'll talk about how to assess the power you have versus your opponents and how to be strategic in building leverage. Then we've got a panel on Monday, July 21st on coordinated bargaining and contract alignment, which I highly recommend. This might be especially good if you're thinking about how you might want to prepare for May Day 2028. And our next Stewards Workshop on Wednesday, July 23rd is on the topic of building up a Stewards network.
We're also planning some in-person Troublemaker schools later this year, including one coming up in September in Durham, North Carolina, and then in Milwaukee and Puget Sound in October. Sign up for any and all of our upcoming events on labornotes.org. Please rate us or leave us a review on Apple or Spotify. If you're listening to us on Podbean at labornotespodcast.podbean.com, download our episode. The Labor Notes podcast is produced by Danielle Smith, Sindhu Sundar, and myself. Our title music was written and performed by Labor Notes Labor Climate Organizer Keith Brower Brown. See you next week. Solidarity, y'all.